The morning Beatrice Shelton rode away from the Langston homestead, she did not look back, and that single act of restraint cost her more than anything she had ever done in her 24 years of living. It was the spring of 1878, and the Kansas plains were just beginning to shake off the last gray grip of winter. The grass along the creek beds had turned a fragile, hopeful green, and the sky stretched overhead in that particular shade of deep blue that only exists in April, when the world seems to be daring you to believe in something again. Beatrice rode a sorrel mare named Cinnamon, a sturdy animal with a white blaze on her forehead, and the saddlebags behind her were packed with a year's worth of what she told herself was necessary courage. Homer Langston stood at the fence post near the barn when she passed through the gate. He was 27 years old, with broad shoulders that came from a decade of honest labor and a jaw that always looked like it was holding back something important. His dark hair curled slightly at the nape of his neck, and his eyes were the pale, steady green of creek water in shallow sunlight. He did not cry. He did not beg. He held the gate post with one hand and watched her go, and that image of him, standing still and solid while the world moved around him, was the one she carried all the way to Wichita and beyond. She had not wanted to leave. That was the part that kept her awake at night for many months afterward, restless in strange beds in unfamiliar towns, listening to the sounds of cattle drives and saloon piano music drifting through thin walls. She had not wanted to go at all. But there was the matter of her father. Robert Shelton was not a cruel man in the way that some men are cruel, meaning he did not raise his hand to Beatrice or speak to her with contempt. He was cruel in the quiet, grinding way of a man who simply would not be moved. He had decided 2 years before, when Beatrice was 22 and newly in love with a cattle rancher's hired hand, that his daughter would not marry beneath her station. And in Robert Shelton's estimation, Homer Langston, a man who worked land he did not yet fully own, who had a mortgage against his modest homestead, who had no family name of consequence in Sedgwick County, was very much beneath her station. Robert Shelton himself was not wealthy, which was perhaps the most bitter irony of the whole business. He ran a dry goods store in the small town of Millhaven, 20 miles east of Homer's land, and he had a tidy house and a respectable reputation, and just enough pride to be genuinely dangerous. He had debts of his own, though he never spoke of them. He wore his respectability like a man wears a coat that is slightly too fine for him, carefully and with great self-consciousness. Beatrice had met Homer at a church social in the autumn of 1876. She had gone with her father and her younger sister Clara, and Homer had come with 2 other men from the ranching community to the south, and they had ended up seated across from each other at one of the long supper tables. Homer had passed her the bread basket and said something quietly funny about the preacher's hat, and she had laughed before she could stop herself, and that had been the beginning of everything. They had courted through that winter and into the spring of 1877. Homer would ride to Millhaven every Sunday without fail, and Beatrice would come to the door in her good dress, and they would walk the length of the town's main street and back again, talking about everything and nothing. He told her about the land he was working, 60 acres along Coyote Creek, and how he planned to run cattle on it once he had the money to build proper fencing and buy his starting herd. He told her about his parents, both gone now, his father to a fever and his mother to something the doctor had called weakness of the lungs but which Homer privately believed was grief. He told her about the loneliness of evenings on the prairie, the way the wind came down from the north in January and made the whole world feel like it was made of cold and silence. She told him about her mother, who had died when Beatrice was 12, and how she had raised Clara with their father, and how Millhaven felt like a jar with the lid screwed on too tight. She told him she wanted open sky and her own kitchen garden and animals to tend. She told him she could shoot a rifle and could ride as well as any man she had ever seen, which made him grin in the way she was quickly coming to love, wide and unguarded, and just a little bit surprised. By summer of 1877, Homer had asked Robert Shelton for his daughter's hand in marriage. Robert Shelton had said no. He had said it politely, with an offer of coffee and a lengthy explanation about Beatrice's future and the instability of farming and the importance of a man establishing himself before taking on the responsibilities of a family. Homer had listened to all of it without expression, then thanked Mr. Shelton for his time, ridden home, and worked himself into exhaustion for the following 3 days cutting fence posts on land that felt suddenly too quiet. Beatrice had been furious in the contained, burning way that had always been her nature. She did not shout at her father. She sat across from him at the kitchen table and laid out her case with the precision of a lawyer, which was something she had learned from reading every newspaper and book that had ever come through her father's store. She was an adult woman. She had the right to make her own decisions. Homer Langston was a good man with a real plan and real land, and a character that anyone in the county would speak to favorably. Robert Shelton had listened to every word she said, and then told her that if she went ahead with this against his wishes, he would cut off the small quarterly payment he had been sending to their aunt in Topeka, a payment that had been keeping their Aunt Vera in a boarding house where she received proper care for her failing health. He was not above using what leverage he had, and that was the trap. Beatrice loved her Aunt Vera with the particular fierce tenderness of a girl who has lost her mother young and found in another woman something of what was missing. Aunt Vera had come to stay for a month when Beatrice's mother died and had never quite left. And when Vera's own health began to decline 3 years ago and she needed to move to Topeka where there was a good doctor, Robert Shelton had quietly taken on that financial obligation and quietly mentioned it to Beatrice whenever she needed reminding of who held the reins. She could not let Aunt Vera lose her care. She simply could not. So she had written Homer a letter, and in it she had explained everything with aching honesty, and then she had ridden to his homestead herself on a Tuesday morning in April of 1878 to say goodbye in person, because she could not bear for a letter to be the last thing between them. Homer had read the letter she had handed him, and then folded it carefully and put it in his shirt pocket, close to his chest, and said, with a steadiness that broke her heart entirely, that he understood. He said he would not stop waiting for things to change. He said, very quietly, with the wind pushing the spring grass flat around them, that some things were worth waiting for. She had mounted Cinnamon and ridden through his gate and not looked back. She was going to Wichita first. There was work there, she had been told, for a woman who could read and write well, keep accounts, and was not afraid of hard work. Her plan was to earn enough money independently over time to take over the payments for Aunt Vera herself, and thereby remove her father's leverage entirely. It was a plan that required patience and time and a great deal of stubborn will, all of which she possessed in abundance. What she did not anticipate was how long it would actually take. Homer Langston went home from that fence post and did not sleep that night. He lay in his narrow bed in his clean but spare bedroom and watched the dark ceiling and thought about leverage and loneliness, and the particular cruelty of circumstances that had nothing to do with love. In the early hours of the morning, sometime before dawn, he got up and went to the kitchen window, the one that faced west toward the road to Millhaven, the road that Beatrice would have taken on her way to Wichita. He lit the oil lantern that sat on the kitchen windowsill, the good one with the brass base that his mother had kept in the parlor back in Ohio, and set it so its light fell across the glass and out into the dark. He told himself it was so late riders could find the lane if they needed a place to water their horses. He knew perfectly well what it was. He set that lantern in the window every single night from that April forward, without exception. Through the blazing Kansas summer when the nights were short and hot, and the grasshoppers came in such numbers they darkened the afternoon sky like a moving storm. Through the autumn when the leaves on the cottonwoods along Coyote Creek went gold, and then brown, and then the trees stood bare and skeletal against the October sky. Through the hard winter, when the snow came horizontal and the temperature dropped to places that froze the water in the bucket before morning, and the flame in the lantern was sometimes the only warm point of light visible in any direction for a mile. Every night, the lantern in the window. He was not waiting passively, it should be said, because Homer Langston was not a passive man. He worked the land with everything he had. He built better fencing along the north and east pastures. He bought 6 head of cattle from a man in Newton who was selling out and moving back east, and he ran them on his creek-bottom grass through the summer and saw them fatten up satisfactorily. He put up a new roof on the barn before the first snow. He repaired the stone foundation of the house where 2 corners had been settling wrong. He planted a kitchen garden in the spring and kept it through the dry months by hauling water from the creek every second evening, and he grew more than he needed, which meant he put up preserves and had jars of them lining the kitchen shelves in colors that seemed almost cheerful against the plainness of everything else. He told himself these were practical improvements to a working property. He knew they were for her. His neighbor to the north, a ruddy-faced German named Ernst Brauer who had come to Kansas in 1869 and now ran 300 head of cattle with the help of his 4 sons, asked Homer once in the late summer of 1878, when he had stopped in for a cup of coffee and noticed the lantern in the window even in the daylight hours where Homer had left it set up, who he was keeping the light for. Homer said a woman he intended to marry. Ernst Brauer drank his coffee and nodded slowly and said that was a good reason. In Wichita, Beatrice had found work more quickly than she expected and found it harder than she had anticipated. The town was in that particular phase of western cow towns where it was simultaneously civilized and completely lawless depending on which street you were standing on. The cattle drives had been the center of Wichita's economy for years, and though they were beginning to shift further west as the railheads moved and the farmers pushed the longhorn trails back, the town still had the roughness of a place that had never entirely decided what it wanted to be. She got work initially as a seamstress for a woman named Mrs. Horton who ran a small dress shop on Douglas Avenue. Beatrice's sewing was competent if not inspired, but she was fast and precise and willing to work long hours, and Mrs. Horton, a sharp-eyed widow who had been running her own business for 15 years, recognized reliable help when she saw it. After 6 weeks, when Mrs. Horton discovered that Beatrice could also keep proper account books, she began paying her more and giving her additional responsibilities in the shop. Beatrice lived in a room at a boarding house run by a Mrs. Patchen, who was strict about noise and visitors after 8 in the evening, but kept a clean house and served 2 meals a day included in the weekly rate. The room was small and faced the alley, which meant she could hear the horses and the occasional drunken argument from the street over, but it was private and hers, and after the first week she had arranged it to feel as much like her own space as possible, with her books on the shelf above the washstand and a small square of embroidered cloth she had made herself years ago propped against the wall above her bed. She wrote to Homer once a month, regular as the calendar. She had told him before she left that she would, and she did not break that promise even in the months when she was so tired she could barely hold the pen upright. She told him about the town and the work and the people she encountered. She described the cattle drives and the dust they raised, and the sound of thousands of longhorns moving through town at the end of their long journeys up from Texas. She described the sunsets over the flat Kansas horizon, which were genuinely extraordinary, great paintings of orange and pink and deep violet that she felt sure no artist had ever adequately captured on canvas. She did not write about how much she missed him. She wrote around it instead, the way you sometimes write around the thing that is largest and most pressing, because to put it plainly seems like it might make the paper catch fire. Homer wrote back. His letters were not eloquent in the way of a man trained to fine language, but they had a quality she found more valuable than eloquence. They were completely honest. He told her about the cattle and the fence and the roof. He told her about the first heavy frost and how the creek had gone quiet and flat under a skim of ice. He told her about the night in November when a young man on a tired horse had come up the lane after midnight looking for shelter from a fast-moving storm, and how Homer had put the horse in the barn and the man by his fire and fed them both breakfast before sending them on their way south. He wrote that the man had noticed the lantern and asked about it, and Homer had said only that he found the dark too dark without it. Beatrice had held that letter to her chest and closed her eyes and tried very hard not to simply ride west immediately. But there was Aunt Vera. There was still the matter of Aunt Vera. She had gone to Topeka in August of 1878, on the train, on a Sunday when Mrs. Horton gave her the day, and spent the afternoon with her aunt in the boarding house there. Vera Shelton was a small, sharp-featured woman of 53 who had lived an interesting life by the standards of her time and place, having spent 12 years as a schoolteacher before her health began to deteriorate, which she described as her lungs simply refusing further cooperation. She was fragile now in the way of drying flowers, still beautiful but requiring care. She knew about Beatrice's situation with her brother and with Homer Langston, because Beatrice had written to her about it. Vera had taken both of Beatrice's hands in her thin ones and said, very directly, that she did not want to be the reason Beatrice sacrificed her happiness, and that if Beatrice's father was using her care as leverage, that was a cruelty on his part and not an obligation on Beatrice's. Beatrice had said that it was not about obligation, it was about love, and you could not just reason love away with logic. Vera had been quiet for a moment, and then said that was the truest thing she had heard anyone say in a long time. What neither of them knew then was that Robert Shelton's dry goods store was in more financial trouble than he had ever admitted. The summer of 1878 had been hard for merchants in small Kansas towns. The drought that had plagued the western part of the state had pushed settlers east and west, and left some towns with significantly fewer customers than the previous year. Robert Shelton had extended credit generously, in the way of a man who is proud of his reputation for fairness, and those credits were now showing on his books as losses. By the winter of 1878, he was managing only just, and by the spring of 1879 he was in genuine difficulty. He did not tell Beatrice any of this, naturally. Pride prevented him. But her sister Clara, who was 19 now and living still at home and helping in the store, wrote to Beatrice in February of 1879, with more information between the lines than Robert Shelton had ever intended to share. Clara's letter described the store as quiet, and the winter as long, and their father as working very late every night over the account books with an expression Clara found worrying. Beatrice read that letter 3 times and then wrote Clara back with several careful questions. Clara answered them. The picture that emerged was of a man who had overextended himself and was now looking at the possibility of selling the store. And if the store went, the payments to Topeka went with it, because there would be no money for them and no income to replace what was lost. Beatrice sat with this information for several weeks, turning it over the way you turn over a stone that has been in the ground a long time and reveals a whole different world underneath. Her father's leverage was failing under its own weight. He had used what he had against her, but circumstances were going to remove it regardless of anything she did or did not do. But she also understood something that was harder to articulate, which was that simply waiting for her father's circumstances to collapse was not the same as building her own life. She had been in Wichita for nearly a year. She had saved money. Not enough, not yet, to fully take on Aunt Vera's care independently, but more than she had started with, and she was building more each month. There was also the fact that she missed Homer Langston with an intensity that had not diminished with time. If anything, it had grown more acute, the way hunger grows more rather than less if you ignore it long enough. She thought about him when she woke in the morning and when she went to sleep at night and in the quiet intervals between tasks during the day. She thought about his voice, which was low and unhurried. She thought about the way he had looked at her across that supper table at the church social, like she was a sentence he very much wanted to finish. She thought about his hands on the fence post the morning she had ridden away, steady and still and letting her go. In the early spring of 1879, two things happened within a week of each other that changed the direction of everything. The first was a letter from her sister Clara, who wrote that their father had indeed sold the store, at a loss, to a merchant from Hutchinson who was expanding east. Robert Shelton had settled what debts he could and was now making arrangements to move in with his brother in Abilene, who had a modest ranch and could use a reliable man for keeping accounts. Clara was going with him, at least for the time being. The quarterly payments to Topeka, Clara wrote, had been the last thing their father had settled before the sale, paying 6 months forward to give Beatrice time to arrange things, which was, Clara noted, probably the most decent thing he had done in 2 years regarding the whole situation. The second thing that happened was a letter from Aunt Vera herself, written in a shakier hand than Beatrice remembered but still sharp and clear in its thinking, saying that the doctor in Topeka had told her she was actually improved, that rest and proper food and dry air had been good for her, and that she might be well enough by autumn to move to a smaller arrangement that would cost significantly less, possibly even a room in a private home where she could be useful in small ways in exchange for her keep. Vera wrote that she was telling Beatrice this because she did not want her niece to overestimate the weight of her circumstance. Beatrice held both letters in her hands at the same time, at the small desk in her boarding house room, on a Tuesday evening in late March of 1879, with the sound of the town outside and the last yellow light of the afternoon coming sideways through her window, and she understood that the trap had sprung itself. She was free. She was, she realized, terrified, because it was one thing to be held apart from what you wanted by circumstance. The longing in that case had a clear object and a clear obstacle and a clear enough shape. But to have the obstacle removed was to be faced with the raw fact of what you wanted, with no excuse between you and the reaching for it. What if too much time had passed? What if he had grown away from her in these 11 months, the way some people grow away from what they once wanted when the wanting goes unanswered too long? What if she rode up that lane and the lantern was no longer in the window? She wrote him a letter that night that she did not finish until nearly midnight. She wrote it 3 times before she was satisfied with it. She told him everything, the whole story of her father and the leverage and Aunt Vera and the store, and the plan she had made for herself in Wichita. She told him she was sorry for the time and the distance, though she was not sorry she had made the choices she had made because they had been the right ones. She told him she was free now, and that her heart had not moved an inch from where it had been standing the morning she rode away. She told him she wanted to come home. She mailed the letter on Wednesday morning, and then she spent the next 4 days in an agony of anticipation that made the previous 11 months look practically serene by comparison. She was short with customers at the dress shop, and Mrs. Horton noticed and asked if she was unwell, and Beatrice said she was fine, just thinking about something, and Mrs. Horton gave her a look that said she understood perfectly what kind of thinking that was. She had told Mrs. Horton the broad outlines of her situation over the past year. Mrs. Horton was a practical woman who had lost her own husband to a fever in 1871 and had built her business in his absence with the determination of someone who has learned that waiting for rescue is a fool's game. She had listened to Beatrice's story without sentimentality but with genuine sympathy, and she had said once, on a slow afternoon when they were both sitting in the back room hemming skirts, that the worst thing about love and circumstance colliding was that the love generally survived the collision, and the circumstance generally did not. But you had to live through all of it before you knew which was which. Beatrice had thought about that observation many times in the following months. Homer's answering letter came on a Saturday, which was faster than she would have imagined possible, which meant he had written the moment her letter reached him and posted it the same day. His reply was brief by the standards of their usual correspondence, only half a page, but it contained the following sentence, which Beatrice read standing in the boarding house hallway with her coat still on from the walk back from the post office. There has not been a single night since the morning you left that the lantern has not been burning in my kitchen window, and I am standing at the gate whenever you are ready to come through it. She stood very still in the boarding house hallway for a full minute. Then she went upstairs and began making arrangements. She gave notice to Mrs. Horton on Monday. Mrs. Horton had been expecting something of the kind and had already begun asking around about who might replace Beatrice, though she said as she was shaking Beatrice's hand that she doubted she would find anyone quite as reliable, and that Beatrice was welcome back if the world ever arranged itself wrong again. Beatrice thanked her with feeling, because she had genuinely come to like and respect the woman, who had been kinder to her in the past year than she had any obligation to be. She paid her final week at the boarding house and said goodbye to Mrs. Patchen and to the handful of other long-term boarders she had come to know, a retired schoolteacher named Mr. Goodall who had been kind and occasionally lent her books, and a young woman named Dolers who worked as a cook at one of the hotels and who had become something approaching a friend over many shared suppers in the dining room. Dolers hugged her firmly and told her to be happy, which Beatrice said she fully intended to be. She had enough saved to take good care of Aunt Vera's arrangements going forward, or at least to bridge the gap until Vera's own situation improved as the doctor expected. She had written to a woman in Topeka, a friend of Mrs. Patchen's, who had a room available and was known to be good-natured about boarders with health considerations. She had sent money ahead to secure the room and written to Aunt Vera explaining the arrangement. Vera had written back, immediately saying Beatrice had done too much and was a better woman than any of them deserved, which made Beatrice cry a little in private and feel very light in her chest afterward. She retrieved Cinnamon from the livery stable where the mare had been boarded for the past 11 months, at considerable expense, but worth every cent because Cinnamon was her horse, and she would not have given her up. The mare was well rested and a little plump from the easy winter, and looked at Beatrice with the mild, alert expression of an animal who is perfectly content and slightly surprised to see the person who has come to disrupt that contentment. Beatrice spent an hour with her, brushing her out and talking to her, because she had always talked to Cinnamon the way some people talk to dogs or to themselves, freely and without editing, and the mare was a perfect listener. She told Cinnamon they were going to see Homer Langston. Cinnamon flicked one ear and then the other and blew a soft breath through her nose. Beatrice saddled her early on a Saturday morning, the 22nd of April, 1879, almost exactly a year since she had last ridden away from the Langston homestead, which she was aware was not an accident. She had chosen the date deliberately, because she was a woman who believed that symmetry mattered, and that the calendar could be made to mean something if you paid attention to it. She rode west out of Wichita in the early morning, when the sky was still that luminous gray-pink of very early dawn, and the dew lay heavy on the grass, and the road was quiet. She had sent a letter ahead the previous Wednesday telling Homer the day she would arrive but not the hour, because she did not know precisely the hour. It was approximately 45 miles from Wichita to the lane that led up to Homer's homestead near Coyote Creek, and she estimated it would take her most of the day riding at a comfortable pace. She was not, as it turned out, going to ride at a comfortable pace. She crossed the Arkansas River at the ford south of Wichita and turned northwest on the track that ran along the higher ground above the creek bottoms. The morning opened up ahead of her in a wash of gold light as the sun came up behind her and pushed her shadow long and thin out in front of Cinnamon's hooves. The prairie was starting its spring awakening with obvious enthusiasm, the grasses green and thick, and threaded through with the early yellow and purple wildflowers that she always thought of as the prairie's way of applauding its own survival of winter. She stopped at noon at a creek crossing to let Cinnamon drink and eat a little of the cold biscuits and dried meat she had packed, sitting on a flat rock above the water and listening to the meadowlarks. She had not heard meadowlarks in Wichita. The town was too loud, too full of its own business. Out here the meadowlark's song rose up clear and bright and landed somewhere in her chest where she had not known a space was waiting for exactly that sound. She thought about everything that had happened in the past year and about everything that was about to happen, and she felt a complicated mixture of joy and nervousness, and the particular sweetness that comes from knowing you are moving toward something true. She had been afraid in the worst of her Wichita months that the feeling would diminish. That time and distance would do what time and distance sometimes do, and erode the thing down to something smaller and more manageable. But it had not happened. If anything, she loved him more honestly now than she had before she left, because she knew more clearly what the world looked like without him in it. She remounted and rode on. The afternoon stretched long and warm. The sky above the Kansas plains was enormous, the kind of sky that makes a person feel simultaneously very small and very free, like being held lightly by something larger than yourself. She passed through two small settlements, hardly more than a general store and a cluster of homesteads around a shared well, and stopped at the second one to fill her canteen and ask directions to confirm she was on the right road. The woman at the store, a stout and pleasant woman with flour on her apron, told her she was right on track and it was about 12 more miles to the Coyote Creek area, and added, unprompted, that it was a fine day for riding. It was. It was a genuinely fine day for riding. She was perhaps 3 miles from Homer's Lane when the light began to change. The afternoon sun was sliding westward, and the shadows were lengthening, and the whole prairie was taking on the deep, warm gold of late afternoon, the kind of light that painters love and that makes even ordinary things look like they mean something important. She could see the line of cottonwoods along Coyote Creek ahead of her, taller and greener than the surrounding grass, and her heart did something complicated and involuntary in her chest. She urged Cinnamon to a trot, and then, because she could not help it, to a canter. She came around the long curve in the track that brought the homestead into view, and there was the house, low and solid, built of stone on the lower half and good timber above, with the barn behind it, and the new fencing she had only heard about in letters stretching in clean lines along the north pasture. There was the kitchen garden, turned and ready for spring planting, in neat rows behind a short fence to keep the animals out. And there was the gate at the end of the lane, and standing at the gate, already standing there, as if he had been standing there for a year, was Homer Langston. He was wearing his good shirt, the dark blue one she remembered, and his hat was in his hand rather than on his head, which she noted without being able to entirely explain why it affected her as much as it did. He was lean and sun-darkened from a year of outdoor work, and he stood with the perfect stillness of a man who has learned to be patient. And when she came cantering up the lane and pulled Cinnamon to a stop in front of the gate, he looked up at her with those pale green eyes, and she saw in them everything she had hoped to see and nothing she had feared. He opened the gate without a word. She rode through it, stopped, dismounted in a quick and practiced movement, and turned to face him. They stood 4 feet apart. Beatrice said, "The lantern," Homer said, "every night." She crossed the 4 feet between them. He put his arms around her and she pressed her face against his chest, and they stood there in the late afternoon light with the prairie wind moving through the cottonwoods and the meadowlarks calling from the fence posts and Cinnamon nibbling contentedly at the good spring grass of the lane. And Beatrice Shelton, who had not cried in 11 months by an act of sheer determined will, finally cried. Homer held her without saying anything else for a long time, because he understood, in the way of a quiet man who pays close attention, that there are moments that do not need words and that filling them with words is a kind of waste. He held her and she held him, and the evening came down slowly and golden around them. Eventually she pulled back and looked up at him, still holding the front of his shirt. "I am sorry," she said, "for all of it. You did right by your aunt," he said. "That was never something to be sorry for." I was gone a year. You came back." He said it with a simplicity that was not simple at all, a simplicity that had been arrived at through 11 months of lantern-lit nights and long, patient work. "That is what I was waiting for." She reached up and put her hand against the side of his face, and he turned into it slightly, the way a man does when he is not aware he is doing it, and she said, "I'm not leaving again." "I know," he said. He led Cinnamon to the barn while Beatrice walked alongside him, and together they rubbed the mare down and put her in a clean stall with water and hay, and Cinnamon settled in with the philosophical acceptance of a horse who has seen enough of the world to appreciate a good barn. Homer had 2 other horses now, a young bay gelding he was training for working cattle, and an older gray mare who functioned as what he called the barnyard's senior authority, and Cinnamon acknowledged both of them across the stall partitions, with the moderate interest of a well-traveled animal. The kitchen was warm from the stove that Homer had lit an hour before, which meant he had known approximately when to expect her, having calculated the riding time from Wichita with the reasonable precision of a man who had lived 45 miles from that city for his entire adult life. There was coffee on the stove and a pot of beans with salt pork that had been cooking since morning, and corn bread in the Dutch oven, and the kitchen smelled so powerfully of warmth and home that Beatrice stood in the doorway for a moment just breathing it. The lantern was on the windowsill, where it had been every night for a year. It was lit, even though it was not yet fully dark, because Homer had lit it that afternoon when he went to stand at the gate, which she thought said everything about him that needed to be said. They ate supper at the kitchen table and talked for 3 hours. They talked about Wichita and the cattle and the store and Aunt Vera and Clara and their father, who was now in Abilene and reportedly adapting to ranch work with the grim determination of a man who has no alternative. They talked about Ernst Brower and his sons, and the neighboring homesteads along Coyote Creek. They talked about Homer's plan for expanding the cattle operation and Beatrice's thoughts on the kitchen garden, and the possibility of adding chickens in the spring. They talked about small things and large things, and the whole conversation had the quality of a river running finally back into its proper channel, moving easily and without obstruction toward where it was always going. At some point in the conversation, Homer said, with a directness that was characteristic of him, that he wanted to ask her again what he had asked her father 2 years ago, only this time he was asking her, and not her father, because it had always been her business and not his. Beatrice said yes before he finished the sentence. He reached across the table and took her hand. She looked at the lantern in the window, burning steady in its brass base. Homer Langston and Beatrice Shelton were married on the 2nd Saturday of June, 1878, in the small church in Millhaven by Reverend Hartwell, who had known Beatrice most of her life, and who shook Homer's hand afterward with the particular firmness of a man approving something long overdue. It was a small wedding, because neither of them was inclined toward large productions, but it was attended by everyone who mattered. Clara had come down from Abilene for it, looking well and happy and delighted by everything, and she hugged Homer with the enthusiasm of a sister-in-law who has been waiting for this moment for longer than seemed fair. Ernst Brower came from the next farm with his wife Hilda and 2 of his sons, and they brought a cured ham and a jar of Hilda's apple butter as wedding gifts, both of which were received with genuine gratitude. Aunt Vera did not come, as the journey would have been too much for her, but she sent a letter that arrived the day before the wedding, written in her increasingly shaky but still elegant hand, saying that she could not be more pleased if she had arranged the whole thing herself, which, given her fondness for arranging things, was saying a great deal. The ceremony was in the afternoon when the light was good, and afterward there was a supper in the churchyard with tables set outside under the cottonwood trees that grew behind the church, and someone produced a fiddle, and someone else a harmonica, and there was dancing on the grass until the stars were fully out overhead, and Beatrice danced with Homer in the firelight with the cottonwood leaves rustling overhead, and the music rising up into the clear June sky. And she thought she had never been as completely and specifically happy as she was in exactly that moment. They rode back to the homestead together that night, just the two of them, because their guests had headed home to their own beds, and Clara was staying at the house in Millhaven for one more night before making the journey back to Abilene. The prairie was silver under a high, bright moon, and the road ran straight and quiet before them, and they rode side by side in comfortable silence for most of the way, which was its own kind of conversation. Homer had made the bedroom as fine as he knew how to make it, which meant clean linens from the dry goods store in Newton, and a jar of wildflowers on the windowsill, purple coneflowers and yellow sunflowers that he had cut from the creek bank that afternoon, and the window open to the warm June night. Beatrice stood in the room and looked at the flowers and laughed, not from anything funny, but from a fullness she could not otherwise express. And Homer looked pleased with himself in the restrained way of a man who is not given to showing off, but is not above noticing when he has done something right. The summer settled over the homestead like a good hand settling over something it is tending. Beatrice threw herself into the work of the place with the energy of someone who has been waiting for a long time to have something worth working for. She expanded the kitchen garden considerably, adding 3 more rows of beans and a whole section devoted to root vegetables that would keep through the winter. And she planted the sunflowers along the south fence because she liked the way they looked, and because the birds liked the seeds in late summer and she liked the birds. She organized the root cellar and the pantry with a thoroughness that was not criticism of Homer's prior arrangements, which had been serviceable if not systematic, but that was simply her way of working through a problem until it was solved. She put up enough preserves through the summer to last 2 winters, or so Homer estimated, which he said with affection rather than complaint. She learned from Hilda Brower how to make a German pickle that she became genuinely devoted to, and Hilda reciprocated by learning from Beatrice how to make the dried apple cake that had been her mother's recipe. Homer's cattle operation grew through the summer. He had purchased 12 more head in May, bringing his total to 18, and the creek bottom grass was good that year. He was building a reputation in the county as a man who kept his agreements and knew his animals, and other small ranchers had begun to consult him informally on matters relating to fencing and water rights along the creek, which Homer took seriously because those were matters that affected everyone along the watershed. There was trouble in August, which had to do with the creek. A man named Caulfield, who had recently acquired land 3 miles upstream, had begun to divert water from Coyote Creek for a mill project without getting the legal rights to do so, which reduced the water flow to the downstream properties in a summer that was already drier than average. Homer went to see Caulfield about it, politely and in person, in the way he preferred to handle problems before they became larger than necessary. Caulfield was not interested in politeness. He was a man with money, and the particular confidence of someone who believes money exempts them from the ordinary rules. Beatrice was the one who suggested the next step, which was to contact the county land office and file a formal complaint about the water diversion, which was indeed illegal under Kansas water law as it stood in 1879. She wrote the complaint herself, carefully, citing the relevant statutes she had looked up in a legal digest she had ordered through the general store in Newton, and it was precise and clear and left very little room for argument. 3 other downstream landowners added their names to it, including Ernst Brower, whose name carried weight in the county. The county land office sent an assessor who found that Caulfield was in violation and ordered the diversion to cease within 30 days. Caulfield was furious and made some remarks around town that Homer heard about and did not take lightly, but nothing came of them except noise, because Caulfield was ultimately more interested in protecting his other business interests than in pursuing a water fight he had already lost. Ernst Brower told Homer afterward that his wife was a formidable woman. Homer said he was already fully aware of that. Beatrice was 3 months into her pregnancy when the water rights business was resolved, which she had known for about 6 weeks but had wanted to be certain of before she told anyone. She told Homer on a Saturday evening in October, sitting on the porch after supper, when the air had that particular autumn sharpness that makes everything feel very clear and slightly too bright. She said it simply because she was a straightforward woman and watched his face. Homer Langston was not a man who expressed large emotions easily or immediately. He sat very still for a moment, looking out at the pasture where his cattle stood in the late light. Then he turned and looked at her with an expression so open and unguarded that it was almost difficult to look directly at, the way it can be difficult to look directly at something very bright. He said, "I am going to need to finish the second bedroom." She laughed and said that was true, and also there might need to be a cradle. He said he would start on the cradle first. He built the cradle out of walnut wood he had been saving from a tree that had come down along the creek the previous winter. He worked on it in the evenings after the day's work was done, in the lamplit kitchen, with Beatrice sitting across the table from him reading or writing letters, and the sound of the tools and the smell of the fresh wood and the quiet between them was the most domestic and content kind of quiet she had ever known. She had written to Aunt Vera and to Clara about the pregnancy, and both letters generated immediate and enthusiastic replies. Clara wrote that she was going to come and help whenever Beatrice needed her, and Aunt Vera wrote a long and affectionate letter full of practical advice about the management of pregnancy in cold weather that showed that her mind remained entirely sharp even as her body demanded its rest. The winter of 1879 to 1880 was cold but not brutally so, which felt like a personal kindness from the weather. Homer had laid in an exceptional store of wood, which Beatrice suspected was not entirely coincidence given her condition, and the house was warm through even the hardest nights. She was large and awkward by December and not particularly gracious about it, which Homer was wise enough to find endearing rather than otherwise. He took on the heavier kitchen work without being asked and without making a ceremony of it, which was one of the things she loved most about him, his practical understanding that help should be given without fanfare. Their son was born in the first week of February, 1880, which was earlier than expected by about 2 weeks, which meant that the process was faster and less orderly than the careful plans they had laid. Clara had come in January to be there for the birth, and it was Clara who rode in the cold dark to fetch the midwife, a competent and warm-spirited woman named Mrs. Calhorn, who had delivered half the children in the surrounding county. Homer paced the kitchen floor for 3 hours, which was the longest he had stood still since the morning at the gate, and when the baby's cry finally cut through the cold air of the February night, he went to the kitchen window and put his hand on the lantern and just stood there for a moment. They named the boy James Robert Langston. The Robert was for Beatrice's father, which was a complicated decision that she had thought about carefully. Her father was not a simple man, and she did not have simple feelings about him, but he was her father and he had made his poor choices out of love in his mistaken way, and she chose to acknowledge that. Homer agreed without difficulty. He said a man's middle name was his business, and if she wanted to give her son a connection to his grandfather, that was her right. James Robert Langston was a large and vigorous baby who announced his opinions loudly and frequently. He had Homer's pale green eyes and Beatrice's dark hair, and the general disposition of someone who intends to be taken seriously from a very early age. Clara stayed for 3 weeks after the birth and was an enormous help, and when she finally had to return to Abilene, she cried at the kitchen door and held the baby one last time and promised to come back in summer. She did come back in summer. She came in July of 1880 and stayed for 2 months, and during those 2 months she met Ernst Brouwer's second eldest son, Wilhelm, who was 22 and had his father's broad shoulders and his mother's good humor, and a steady way of looking at the world that Beatrice recognized as the kind of dependability that matters more than charm. Clara and Wilhelm met at a community gathering at the Brower farm in early August, and were observed by Beatrice to have a very long and apparently absorbing conversation about horses, which Beatrice noted to Homer that evening as a promising sign. Homer said horses were a fine thing to agree on. Beatrice said she thought it was more about the horses being an excuse to keep standing in the same place, which Homer acknowledged was probably true. Clara and Wilhelm's courtship was a gentler and less complicated affair than Beatrice and Homer's had been, in part because Robert Shelton was in Abilene and took very little active interest in his daughter's matrimonial situations now that the store was gone and his leverage with it, and in part because Wilhelm Brower was not a man anyone could object to sensibly. They were married the following spring, in May of 1881, in the same church in Millhaven where Homer and Beatrice had married, and the wedding was cheerful and well attended, and Ernst Brower cried openly during the ceremony in the way of a big man who is not in the least ashamed of his feelings. With Clara settling on the Brower farm to the north, Beatrice had her closest family within 3 miles, which was a pleasure she had not anticipated, and which changed the texture of daily life considerably. The two women visited often, riding between the farms in good weather and sending notes by way of whichever Brower son happened to be going in the right direction in bad. They helped each other through the demands of farming life with the practical solidarity of women who understand that help freely given is the only kind that is worth anything. Aunt Vera made the journey from Topeka in the summer of 1881, once the doctor had confirmed she was well enough to travel. She came on the train to Wichita and Homer drove the wagon down to collect her, and she arrived at the homestead in the late afternoon of a July day when the light was long and golden, and the sunflowers along the south fence were in full blazing bloom. She sat on the porch with James, who was now 18 months old and deeply interested in everything, and she held his hands while he pulled himself to standing against her knees, and she looked at the farm and the pasture and the clean lines of the fencing and the kitchen garden bursting with late summer abundance, and she said to Beatrice, who was sitting beside her, that it was exactly what she had imagined for her. Beatrice said she thought it was better than imagination. Vera stayed for 6 weeks, which was longer than intended but shorter than Beatrice would have liked. She slept in the room that had been meant as a study but which Beatrice had furnished as a guest room in anticipation of just this kind of visit, and she woke early and sat in the kitchen with her tea and watched the farm begin its morning and appeared, by all evidence, genuinely content. Her health was better than it had been in years, which the doctor in Topeka attributed to the improved arrangements Beatrice had made for her and the drier air of the Kansas climate, and which Beatrice privately attributed also to the absence of anxiety, because Aunt Vera, like Beatrice herself, did not thrive under the weight of unresolved things. They had long conversations in the evenings after James was in bed, the kind of conversations that had not been possible when Beatrice was a girl because Vera had not known then how much her niece could handle, and Beatrice had not known then how much she needed to hear. They talked about Beatrice's mother, who had been Vera's sister, and about what she had been like as a young woman before the years and the work and the grief had done their reshaping. They talked about what it meant to want things and to wait for them, and to recognize them when they arrived. They talked about loneliness and the different kinds of it, the lonely of being alone and the lonely of being with the wrong person, and Vera said the second kind was much worse in her experience, and Beatrice said she understood why now in a way she had not before she had the comparison. Homer sat with them sometimes in the evenings, reading by the lamp while they talked, and he and Vera had arrived at an easy warmth with each other that Beatrice found quietly satisfying. Vera said once, in one of her direct and unhedged ways, that she had been glad of Robert Shelton's stubbornness in one respect only, which was that if Homer Langston had given up after the first refusal and gone off and found someone else, her niece would have been robbed of the best thing that was available to her. And since he had not given up, she supposed things had worked out as well as they were going to. Homer said he had not considered giving up. Vera looked at him for a moment and then said, yes, she supposed she knew that. The years settled into their patterns, which were not the patterns of ease or idleness, but the patterns of a life that has found its proper shape. Homer's cattle operation continued to grow, slowly and steadily, which was the pace that suited him. By 1882, he was running 40 head and had hired a young man named Preston to help with the work, a quiet and industrious 18-year-old from a family in Newton, who had been recommended by the blacksmith there, and who earned his wages and then some. Preston boarded in town and came out to the farm in the mornings, and had the useful quality of being good with the animals, and not needing a great deal of supervision once he understood what was expected. Beatrice continued to manage the farm accounts, and the household with the same precision she had brought to Mrs. Horton's dress shop accounts in Wichita, and the farm reflected it. She was not extravagant, but she was strategic, and her instinct for where money should be invested and where it should be held was good. When Homer suggested in the spring of 1882 that they might look at acquiring the 30 acres of creek bottom land adjacent to their south pasture, which the owner was looking to sell, Beatrice had already done the arithmetic and had an opinion about what it was worth and what they could offer. They bought it, and the additional pasture made a real difference to the cattle's condition through the following dry summer. Their second child came in the winter of 1883, a daughter this time, arriving with considerably more ceremony than James had but also more warning, and Clara came again and Mrs. Calhorn came, and the whole business was attended with the organized competence of people who had been through it before. They named her Eleanor Vera, for Vera, who received the news in a letter that caused her to sit very still in her room in Topeka for several minutes, and then write back 3 pages without stopping. Eleanor Vera Langston was a different kind of child from her brother, quieter and more observant, with the air of someone conducting a very long and thorough evaluation of everything around her. She had Beatrice's dark hair and Homer's patience, and what Aunt Vera, when she met the baby the following summer, called the eyes of someone who is going to know exactly what she wants and how to get it, which she said was a high compliment. James, at 3 years old, received his sister with the magnanimous interest of a small person who is old enough to understand that this is important and young enough to not yet have strong feelings about the redistribution of attention. He was a cheerful, solid child who spent a great deal of time following Homer around the farm asking questions about every visible thing, and Homer answered every question with the same patient thoroughness he brought to everything else, which meant James received a comprehensive early education in the workings of a cattle farm and the names of grasses and the behavior of weather systems crossing the Kansas prairie. In the evenings, Homer still lit the lantern and put it in the kitchen window. Beatrice noticed this on a winter evening in 1883 after the children were in bed and she was sitting at the kitchen table with her mending, and she looked up and saw him set the lantern in its place the way he did every night, automatically, the same gesture he had been making for 5 years, and she said, very quietly, "You still do it every night." He looked at the lantern and then at her. He said, "It is a good habit." She said, "What are you keeping it for now?" He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Now it is not for waiting, now it is for having." She set her mending down. He said, "It is so that anyone on that road knows there is someone here. So you know when you ride in that there is someone here. So the children know when they are old enough to understand it. It means this house is alive and there are people in it who are glad to be here." She got up and went to stand beside him at the window, looking out at the darkness where the lane ran down to the gate and the lantern threw its warm light across the glass and out into the cold night. She took his hand. He held it. The years did not stop, of course. They never do. They kept coming in the way that years come, each one different from the last and yet built on the same foundation, season following season, with the reliable rhythm of the prairie, which has no interest in drama and every interest in continuity. The cattle operation kept growing under Homer's careful management. By 1885, he was running 65 head and had acquired a second parcel of land, 40 acres to the north, that Ernst Brower's eldest son had decided to sell when he opted to move to Colorado with his wife's family. Homer had offered a fair price, and Ernst Brower had told him privately that he was glad the land was going to someone he trusted to manage it right. Preston, the young man from Newton, had become in the years of his employment less an employee and more the kind of person who is simply part of how a place works. He was a competent hand with cattle and a decent carpenter, and had the loyalty of a dog and the good sense not to speak when he had nothing to say, which Homer valued considerably. By 1884, they had built him a small cabin at the edge of the north pasture, so he did not have to ride in from town each morning, and he had furnished it sparingly, and moved in with the air of someone who has found the place they are supposed to be. James started school at the one-room schoolhouse in the next settlement east, a mile and a half from the farm, in 1886 when he was 6 years old, and he went on his own pony, a compact roan named Fitz that Homer had purchased specifically for the purpose, and he rode that mile and a half every school day morning, with the seriousness of a child who has been waiting for school to start, with the same focused anticipation with which he approached everything. His teacher was a young woman named Miss Howell, recently arrived from Ohio, who wrote to Beatrice at the end of James's first month saying that her son was very bright and asked more questions than any child she had taught, which she wrote as a compliment but with a very slight edge to it that made Beatrice smile. Eleanor started the same school 2 years later, in 1888, and was reported by Miss Howell to be attentive and very precise, and to have an excellent memory for numbers. Beatrice and Homer drove into Newton together for the county fair in September of 1887, leaving the children with Clara and Wilhelm for the weekend, which was the first time they had been anywhere alone together since before James was born. They drove the 30 miles in the good wagon behind Homer's steady bay team, on a September morning when the sky was the particular crystalline blue of high autumn and the prairie had gone to all its dry gold and russet colors, and the whole journey felt slightly unreal in the way that doing something ordinary outside of its ordinary context always does. At the fair they saw cattle judging and a horse race, and a display of agricultural machinery that Homer examined with the same serious interest he gave to everything mechanical. They ate fried pies from a vendor's stand, and Beatrice won a blue ribbon in the preserves competition for her peach butter, which she accepted from the judging committee with the collected manner of someone who had been fairly confident of winning. They walked through the whole fair ground twice, and sat in the late afternoon on a bench outside the exhibition hall, and watched the crowd and talked with the ease of people who have no shortage of things to say to each other. Homer said, at some point in that afternoon, in the way of a man arriving at a thought he has been working toward for a while without knowing it, that he thought this was the best version of his life he could have imagined, which was not something he would have been able to say to anyone else without embarrassment, but which he could say to her because she was the foundation of it. Beatrice thought for a moment about everything that had been required to arrive at that bench, at that fair, on that September afternoon. The year of waiting, and the lantern and Wichita, and the letters, and Aunt Vera and her father's small cruelties and large failures, and the morning she had ridden away, and the morning she had ridden back. She said that she agreed with him. She said it was also, to be fair, the best version of her own life that she could have imagined, and that she had a fairly capable imagination. He smiled, that wide and unguarded smile that had been one of the first things about him, and she put her hand through his arm, and they watched the last of the afternoon fair crowd move through the golden late light. The drive back to the homestead on Sunday evening was quiet and comfortable, the kind of quiet that is not empty but full, full of the contentment of people who are where they are supposed to be. The children were still awake when they arrived, barely, and there was a mild commotion of reunion before beds were finally achieved. And then the house went still, and Homer lit the lantern and set it in the window, and they sat together at the kitchen table as they did every evening. And the night outside was very dark and very quiet, and the lantern burned steady and warm against the glass. Aunt Vera passed away peacefully in the early spring of 1889, at the age of 63, in her room in Topeka. The woman who ran the house she had been living in for the past several years, the private arrangement that had worked so well, wrote to Beatrice immediately, and Beatrice read the letter in the kitchen at the table and sat with it for a long time. Homer was in from the pasture an hour later and found her there and sat down beside her, and she told him. And he put his arm around her, and she leaned against him, and they sat quietly together, while the spring wind moved around the house outside. She grieved for Vera with the focused honesty that was her way with difficult things, not avoiding it or making it smaller than it was, but also not letting it overwhelm the rest of what was living. Vera had died well and comfortably and with people around her who had been kind, and in the years before that she had known about James and Alina and the farm and the good life Beatrice had made for herself. She had known. That mattered. Beatrice made the trip to Topeka to settle Vera's affairs, taking the train from Wichita the way she had done 11 years before as a young woman with a plan and a savings account and a sorrel mare and a longing she was trying to outthink. The city had changed in those years, and she had changed in those years, and the trip was no longer solitary, because Homer had come with her, which changed everything about how it felt to arrive somewhere that had complicated memories attached to it. They settled Vera's small estate, which consisted of some books and several pieces of embroidery, and a quantity of letters tied in ribbon that Beatrice took home in a bundle. And they visited the grave and said goodbye in the direct, honest way that Vera would have approved of, and they had dinner at a fine restaurant in the city that evening, the kind of dinner that was slightly too expensive and entirely worth it. And they talked about Vera, and about Beatrice's mother, and about the particular luck of having people in your life who love you well, even when their circumstances are complicated. On the train going home the next morning, Beatrice looked out the window at the Kansas plains rolling by under an April sky, and thought about the last time she had been on this particular train going in the opposite direction, 11 years ago, heading to Wichita with everything she owned in 2 bags and enough will to get through whatever was coming. She thought about who she had been then and who she was now, and the distance between those 2 women was not the distance of loss but the distance of becoming, and she felt it clearly and was grateful for it. She turned from the window and looked at Homer, who had fallen asleep in the seat across from her with his hat over his eyes in the manner of a man who can sleep anywhere when he has no particular reason to be anxious about anything. And she felt the same thing she had felt standing at the gate with his arms around her in the April afternoon 10 years before, only deeper and quieter and more thoroughly settled into the bones. The summer of 1889 brought a drought, the worst in several years, and the pastures along Coyote Creek went brown earlier than usual and stayed brown longer. Homer moved the cattle to the creek bottom land where there was still some feed, and reduced his herd by selling 10 head in July before the late summer market softened further, which was the right call by any economic standard, and which Beatrice confirmed when she worked through the numbers on his behalf. The kitchen garden suffered despite the water she hauled up from the creek, with a dedication that bordered on personal combat, but she managed to save enough of it to put up a reasonable store for winter, and the root vegetables came through better than the above-ground plants because the ground retained more moisture than the air. It was a hard summer but not a desperate one, because they had managed the farm well enough in the good years to weather the bad ones, which was the whole point of the careful way they had always operated. Ernst Brouwer, riding over one evening in August to talk about the water situation on the shared section of creek, told Homer that he was in better shape than most of the smaller operations he knew of, and that a man who managed well in good times was a man who survived the bad ones, which was a straightforward observation, but one that Homer received with appropriate gravity. By September, the rains had come back, gentle and persistent, and the grass began its recovery, and the creek ran fuller again, and the autumn color came to the cottonwoods with the particular beauty that dry years sometimes produce, all fire and copper and deep gold, as if the trees are making up for the hard summer with a more extravagant farewell. James was 9 that autumn and had begun to show the first signs of being genuinely interested in the cattle work in the way that goes beyond a child's general interest in everything their father does, and becomes something more focused. He rode out with Homer on weekend mornings and asked his now more specific questions about herd management and grass and water and the economics of selling and buying cattle, and Homer answered them all with the same patient fullness as always, only now with the additional satisfaction of knowing the information was landing somewhere it would be used. Eleanor, at 6, was developing the independent and precise personality that Vera had predicted, and that Beatrice recognized as her own nature reflected back in a smaller, and as yet unformed version. Eleanor had an intense relationship with the chickens that Beatrice had introduced to the farm 3 years earlier, which she managed with a seriousness that the chickens appeared to find appropriate. She had named each one and kept mental track of their egg-laying with an accuracy that Beatrice confirmed against her own records and found consistently correct, which was simultaneously amusing and genuinely impressive. On an evening in October of 1889, when the children were in bed and the harvest was in, and the cattle were settled, and the account books showed a year that, despite the hard summer, had come out on the right side, Homer and Beatrice sat on the porch in the cool autumn air and watched the stars come out over the prairie, which they did with a sweeping abundance in the clear, dry nights of fall. The Milky Way thrown across the sky in that great pale river of light that you can only really see when there are no other lights for miles. Homer said, quietly and without particular preamble, that he thought next spring they ought to put a proper covered porch on the south side of the house, because the current one was too narrow, and he had been thinking about it for a while, and he could do the framing himself with Preston's help, and it would mean they had a proper place to sit in the evening. Beatrice said she thought that was an excellent idea, and that while they were at it they should think about extending the garden fence on the east side, because she had plans for a proper herb garden that she had been postponing for 2 years for lack of the right space. Homer said he could do the fence at the same time. She said good. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the stars. He said after a while that there was one other thing he had been thinking about. She waited. He said he thought it might be time to consider whether they had room and resources for a third child, which was something he had been turning over in his mind for a year or so but had not raised because the timing had not been right, and he had not wanted to presume what she wanted. Beatrice was quiet for a moment, looking at the stars. She said she had been thinking the same thing. Homer said, in the understated way of a man who has learned that understatement is sometimes the most expressive register available, that he was glad they were thinking the same thing. Their third child, another son, arrived in November of 1890, and they named him Franklin, which was a name that had belonged to Homer's uncle, and which Homer had always liked for its directness. Franklin arrived with the absolute minimum of ceremony, as if he had made a decision and executed it, which Beatrice would later describe as characteristic. He was a healthy baby with red gold hair that was entirely unexpected and entirely charming, and which Clara, arriving 2 days after the birth with a pot of soup, and a determination to be helpful, immediately declared was from their mother's side of the family, there having been a red-haired Shelton 2 generations back. James, 10 years old now and fully formed in his character, received his second younger sibling with the amused patience of someone who is old enough to know how these things work, and to find them mildly entertaining. Eleanor, at 7, took one look at Franklin and announced that he was hers to look after, which she proceeded to mean very seriously for the next several years, appointing herself his primary interpreter to the world in the way of confident older children who are not asking permission. The farm continued. The seasons continued. The lantern burned in the kitchen window every night. Homer added 2 new cattle dogs to the farm in 1891, a mother and son pair from a neighboring ranch that had more dogs than they needed, and the dogs became indispensable within their first month, which Homer had expected, and which Beatrice had not. She had expected them to be useful, and she had not expected to become genuinely fond of them, and yet she did, in the practical and unsentimental way that she became fond of useful and reliable things. James started working full days on the farm in summers by the time he was 12, which he did with the focus and competence of a boy who has found the thing he is meant to do and is in no doubt about it. He had Homer's patience and Beatrice's precision, and his own particular quality of being able to read what an animal was thinking, which was not something you could teach, and which made him very good with cattle. In 1893, when James was 13, Homer took him to the cattle market in Newton for the first time as a full participant rather than an observer, meaning he gave James responsibility for part of the transaction, specifically the evaluation of a small group of young stock they were considering buying, and James performed his evaluation with a thoroughness that impressed the seller and several of the other buyers who observed it. And Homer bought the cattle on his son's recommendation, and they did well on it. And on the drive home, Homer told James he had done good work, which was, coming from Homer Langston, the equivalent of a standing ovation. Beatrice and Homer talked in the evenings as they always had, at the kitchen table or on the porch depending on the weather, and their conversations had the quality of a river that has been flowing through familiar country long enough to have carved its own shape into it, deep and sure, and going somewhere known. They disagreed sometimes, as people who are genuinely engaged with each other will, and their disagreements had the quality of their agreements, direct and honest and resolved before bed, because neither of them had patience for things left half-finished. She read to him sometimes in the evenings, from the newspapers that came weekly, and from the books she continued to order, on topics ranging from agricultural science to history to the novels that she had read since she was young. He was a good listener, Homer, in the way that extended to a real engagement with what he was hearing, asking questions and offering thoughts that showed he had been paying attention, and some of their best conversations came from the things she read aloud and the thoughts they expanded into together. In the spring of 1895, a family arrived in the district from Ohio, a father and mother and 3 children, looking to settle and start a farm on a parcel of land to the southeast that had been unclaimed for several years. Their name was Matthias, and they arrived with a wagon and a determination and a complete absence of local knowledge that made the first season considerably harder for them than it needed to be. Beatrice was the first neighbor to visit, because she remembered what it was to be new to a place, and she brought bread and preserves and a considerable amount of practical information delivered without condescension, which Mrs. Matthias, a reserved and proud woman, received with a gratitude she expressed in relatively few words but with unmistakable feeling. Homer helped Mr. Matthias with the well, which was in the wrong place as originally cited, and with the first understanding of the local weather patterns, which were different enough from Ohio to require a period of adjustment. By the end of that first summer, the Matthias family had found their footing and begun to belong to the landscape in the way that settlers do when they have made the fundamental decision that this place is theirs. Their daughter Ruth, who was 16, became Aliner's closest friend, which was the beginning of a friendship that would endure for decades, and which started simply because Ruth Matthias was one of the few people Aliner had ever met who could keep up with her in an argument. The summer of 1897 was good, one of the best in memory for rainfall and grass, and Homer's cattle came through the season in excellent condition, and he sold at strong prices in October, and came home from Newton with enough to consider something he had been thinking about for 3 years, which was building a proper second barn on the north pasture. He and Beatrice sat with the plans and the numbers for a week, and then decided yes, and the barn went up in November with the help of Preston, and 2 of the Matthias boys and Wilhelm Brower's eldest son, who was 18 now, and turning into the kind of steady, reliable person that his father and grandfather were. And the raising was attended with the neighborly energy of a community that understood that each improvement on any one farm made the whole district a little more solid. James was 17 by the winter of 1897, and had grown into the tall and quiet person that his character had always been pointing toward. He had his father's build and his mother's dark eyes, and the combination of patience and precision that both of them carried in their different ways. He was increasingly the first point of contact with the cattle in the mornings, arriving at the barn before Homer some days, and there was a quality in the way he handled the work that told Homer, watching without comment, that the farm had a future beyond himself. Aliner was 14 and possessed of strong opinions about nearly everything, which she expressed with a frankness that was sometimes startling to people who did not know her. She was brilliant at numbers and at the written word, having inherited Beatrice's precision with language, and her schoolteacher, now a different woman than the Miss Howell of her earliest years, had written to Beatrice suggesting seriously that Aliner might be considered for one of the county academies that were beginning to establish themselves in the larger towns. Beatrice and Homer discussed this for several evenings. It was not a simple question. The cost was not inconsiderable, and the distance would mean Aliner living away from home, which was a thing Beatrice understood from her own experience had its own costs. But she also understood, perhaps better than anyone, what it meant to have a mind that needed more than the immediate available world could provide, and she did not want to be the reason her daughter found out too late what she might have been given more room to become. Homer said that if Aliner wanted to go, they would find a way to make it possible. Beatrice went to Aliner and told her about the academy and what it would mean and asked her what she thought. Aliner was quiet for a moment in the way she had when she was genuinely thinking rather than simply preparing to speak, and then she said she would like to go, if they could manage it, because she wanted to be a teacher, and she thought you ought to be educated as well as possible for the thing you wanted to do. They managed it. Aliner went to the county academy in Newton in the autumn of 1899, when she was 16, boarding with a family there who had been recommended by the Browers, and she applied herself to her studies with the focused intensity that had always characterized her best work. She came home for holidays and summers and brought books with her both directions, and the conversations at the Langston kitchen table in the summers of her academy years had a new dimension, because Aliner was being taught to argue from evidence, and she was very good at it. Franklin, at 9 in 1899, was discovering horses with the passion of someone who has found their element. He had an instinctive understanding of horses that was different in character from James's gift with cattle, more intuitive and less analytical, and Homer recognized it as something to be fostered and let alone. The red-gold hair had darkened slightly as he grew but was still warm and distinctive, and he had Beatrice's frankness, and what seemed to be his own particular quality of pure joy in the physical world, in speed and open sky, and the feeling of a good horse running, that was entirely his own. The turn of the century came to Coyote Creek, Kansas, with the same combination of ordinary daily life and extraordinary private significance that all large markers of time carry when you are living through them, rather than looking back. Homer was 49 years old in the year 1900, and Beatrice was 46, which seemed to both of them a remarkable distance from the church social in the autumn of 1876, when he had passed her the bread basket, and she had laughed before she could stop herself. On the evening of the last day of the 19th century, they sat on the covered porch that Homer had built in 1890, the good wide one on the south side of the house, with lanterns lit against the winter dark, and they could see through the kitchen window the glow of the lantern that burned on the windowsill as it did every night. The children were all present, James at 20 home from the farm where he now spent his days, Eleanor at 17 home from the academy for the holiday, Franklin at 9 on the porch with a blanket and an expression of determined wakefulness that was not going to last until midnight but was making a good effort. Beatrice thought about all the things the previous century had contained for her, her own life and its turns and the lives of the people she loved, and she thought about what it was to build something together over years, not just the farm, though the farm was real and solid and a genuine achievement, but the life inside it, the daily accumulation of small, honest things. The conversations, the letters written and received, the children brought into the world and shaped and sent into their own futures, the grief and the joy and the ordinary Tuesday evenings that were, when you looked back at them, as important as any of the dramatic days. Homer said, in the quiet way he had that always landed like something that had been considered before it was spoken, that he thought the next century was going to be fine. She said she thought so too. Franklin fell asleep in his chair at 10 minutes to midnight, and Homer carried him in without disturbing him further, and James and Eleanor sat with their parents on the porch and watched the year turn over under the vast Kansas sky. And at midnight someone in the direction of Newton set off fireworks that they could see as small bright blooms of color on the southern horizon, too far away to hear but visible, like something celebrating itself. The new century arrived, and the farm continued, and the family continued, and the lantern continued to burn in the kitchen window each night. And in the mornings the gate stood open, because it was a working farm and people came and went. And in the evenings it was closed and latched, and the smoke rose from the chimney and the light showed in the windows, and anyone passing on that road could see that someone lived there, that there were people inside who were glad to be there, and who had arrived at that gladness through the particular long path of people who have chosen each other and meant it. James married in 1902 a young woman named Hannah Stroud from a family north of Newton, and they built a small house on the north parcel of land that Homer had acquired years before, which meant the farm was still a family operation, and Homer could see his son working the land he had worked himself for 25 years, which was a satisfaction that went deeper than anything he could have articulated, and that he did not try to articulate, simply carrying it in the same way he carried everything of great importance, quietly and close. Hannah was a practical and good-humored young woman who adapted to farm life with the resourcefulness of someone who has never expected things to be easy and is pleasantly surprised when they are. She and Beatrice had a good relationship from the beginning, based on mutual respect and a shared understanding of the work required to run a household well, and the two women fell into a natural collaboration of the kind that makes family life function smoothly, each contributing what she had to offer without competition. Eleanor came home from Newton in 1903, fully certified and ready to teach, and took a position at the schoolhouse in the same settlement where she and James had once ridden daily on their ponies. She boarded initially with Ruth Matthias's family, which suited both young women, and she taught 32 children with the precision and warmth that were equally parts of her character, and by all accounts was exactly the teacher she had set out to become. Franklin, at 13 in 1903, had grown into a person who spent every available hour with the horses and had begun to develop a reputation, modest but real, for being able to train difficult animals that other handlers had given up on. Homer bought him a young horse of his own that spring, a 3-year-old black with a crooked blaze and a complicated personality, and watching Franklin work with that horse through the summer was like watching something fulfill its own nature, completely and without wasted effort. In the evenings, always, the lantern in the window. Beatrice was 50 years old in the autumn of 1903, and she marked it not with ceremony but with a long ride on a crisp October morning. Just herself and Cinnamon, who was long gone by now, replaced by a good steady bay mare she had ridden for the past 6 years, and who suited her as completely as Cinnamon once had. She rode the perimeter of the farm, all the land that had been acquired in 25 years of careful work, and she looked at the fencing and the creek and the pastures and the second barn and the house at the center of it all with its smoke and its garden and its gate, and she thought, this is what I came back to. This is what the lantern was for. This is what all of it was for. She rode home through the gate as the morning was becoming midday, and Homer was at the barn with Preston, who was 41 now and as much a part of the place as any fence post. And Homer looked up when she came through the gate and raised a hand in greeting, and she raised her hand back. That evening James and Hannah came for supper, and Alina and Franklin were both home that week. Alina between school weeks and Franklin simply because he was usually around, and they ate at the long table in the kitchen that Homer had built himself years ago to replace the original smaller one, built to seat more people than they had been when Beatrice first came home. And the kitchen was full of noise and food, and the particular warmth of a family that has found its shape. After supper, when James and Hannah had gone home up the lane, and Alina was reading in the sitting room, and Franklin had gone to the barn for a last check on his difficult black horse, Homer lit the lantern and set it in the kitchen window. Beatrice was washing the supper dishes, and she watched him do it in the window's reflection, the same gesture that he had been making for 25 years, since the April night in 1878 when he had put a brass-based lantern in the window of a quiet farmhouse and kept it there every night for a year until the morning she came back. She said, softly, "Homer." He turned. She said, "Thank you for keeping the light." He looked at her for a moment, across the warm kitchen, with the lantern burning on the windowsill between them and the dark Kansas night outside. He said, "It was always yours." She dried her hands on the kitchen towel and crossed the room to him, and he put his arm around her the way he had been putting his arm around her for 24 years of marriage, without drama or effort, just the natural accommodation of two people who have grown to fit around each other. They stood at the window together in the warm light of the lamp and looked out at the dark lane and the gate at the end of it and the road beyond. The lantern burned. In the years that followed, there were more seasons and more improvements and more children in the house, because James and Hannah had 2 boys by 1906, and Alina came home to the farm eventually, having met the county surveyor in 1907, in the way these things happen, without planning, at a community dinner, and having married him the following spring and settled within 4 miles, which was close enough that she could ride over on a Tuesday morning to help her mother with preserves and still be home before dark. Franklin left the county in 1910, at 20 years old, following horses in the way that some people follow rivers, to see where they go, and he settled in Colorado where the ranching country suited him, and where he built a good life with horses, and eventually with a wife and their children, writing home monthly with the steady faithfulness that the Langstons had always brought to correspondence. Homer was 58 when Franklin left for Colorado, and he stood at the gate and watched his youngest ride away the way he had stood at the gate. The morning, a young woman on a sorrel mare had ridden away 22 years before, and Beatrice came and stood beside him and slipped her hand into his. He held it. She said, "He will be fine." Homer said, "I know," she said, "and he will write." Homer said, "I know that too." They stood at the gate together until Franklin was out of sight, and then they turned back toward the house and the farm and the work of the day. And that evening, Homer lit the lantern and set it in the kitchen window as he always did, and it burned there through the night as it always had, In the window of the house on Coyote Creek, where Homer Langston had kept a light burning through every season of his life since the spring of 1878, because some things were worth waiting for, and some things, having arrived, were worth keeping lit forever. The morning always came. The gate stood at the end of the lane. The lantern burned in the window. And in the long, good story of everything that had happened between the riding away and the riding back, between the first letter and the last one, between the church social and the children and the grandchildren just beginning their own lives in the new century, Homer and Beatrice Langston had built something that was quietly and entirely extraordinary. The ordinary life of two people who had chosen each other completely, and who found, every single day without exception, that they had chosen correctly.